Right, so here's a thought I keep coming back to. Most of us have this show on in the background at some point in our lives. Sick day off school, hotel telly, in a country where you don't speak the language, 3 in the morning when you can't sleep. A yellow sponge, a pink starfish, a restaurant that sells burgers, safe as houses, and yet somewhere in that same show there's a silent film vampire from 1922. An army of skeletons, a void with no light and no matter in it, and a bloke burying a body behind a restaurant. That's what tonight is. We're going through the strange ones. The episodes that people remember being oddly unsettled by. The ones that turn up in every "why was this in a kid's cartoon" thread. And the reasons behind them. Who wrote them. What they were referencing. What got cut. There's no big finish. Nothing you need to stay awake for. If you drop off during the graveyard bit, you haven't missed anything. And it'll still be here tomorrow. If you fancy subscribing, that's lovely. It helps a lot. Anyway, let's get into it. So before we get to any actual episodes, I want to start somewhere slightly sideways, because I think it explains a lot about why this show is the way it is. The town is called Bikini Bottom, and for years there was this fan theory floating around the internet that the name wasn't a coincidence, that Bikini Bottom sits underneath Bikini Atoll, which is a real place, a ring of coral in the Marshall Islands out in the Pacific. The theory said all the talking, walking, instrument-playing sea creatures were the result of what happened there. Now, normally that's where a fan theory lives and dies. Somebody posts it, it gets a few thousand upvotes, everyone moves on. Except this one got confirmed. Tom Kenny, who voices SpongeBob, said in an interview back in 2015 that yes, the town is named after the atoll. Fine, that's a naming thing, that's not much on its own. But then years later, there's this cast conversation with Esquire, all the main voices sitting around together, and Roger Bumpass, Squidward, mentions offhand that he's always liked the theory about the atomic testing, and Mr. Lawrence, who voices Plankton and has written a huge chunk of the show, just says, and that is true. That is absolutely true. Bumpass's reaction is my favourite part. He goes, essentially, hang on, it's true? I've been telling people it wasn't true. And Lawrence keeps going. He says it was part of the fun of it, the question of how far they were going to take that concept. He also let slip that, in the earliest version, the rest of the world was meant to be gone. Post-apocalyptic. Bikini Bottom as the last thing left. That got dropped early in the first season's development, which is probably for the best because the show ended up making 4 films in which people walk around on dry land buying novelty t-shirts. But it was in there. At the start, it was in there. Now, here's where I want to slow down a bit, because the real history underneath that is not a spooky story, and I don't want to treat it like one. The United States ran 67 nuclear tests in that area between 1946 and 1958. The people who lived on Bikini Atoll, 167 of them, were moved off their own islands so it could happen. And the biggest of those tests, Castle Bravo, went off on the 1st of March, 1954. It destroyed 3 islands, outright. The fallout affected Marshallese people across the region, and the health consequences of that did not stop when the testing program did. They're still being dealt with. Right now. So when I say the cartoon is built on top of that, I don't mean it in a creepy way. I mean it as a fact about where the setting came from. And I think it's worth sitting with for a second, rather than skating past it for a chill down the spine. What I find interesting is what it does to the show retroactively, because there's a version of this theory that people tell to make SpongeBob sinister, and I've never really bought that version. The show isn't secretly sad. It's not a coded warning. It's a comedy about a sponge who loves his job too much. But it does explain a certain quality that runs underneath everything. There's a logic in Bikini Bottom that never quite settles. Things are alive that shouldn't be. Scale doesn't work. A snail meows. A squirrel lives in a glass dome. And nobody finds it remarkable. Once you know the setting was born out of somebody thinking about what the ocean does after something enormous happens to it, all of that reads slightly differently. Not scarier, just stranger. which is, I think, the more useful word for this whole video. And that brings me to the other half of why this show keeps stumbling into horror, which is the man who made it. Steven Hillenburg was a marine biologist before he was an animator. That's not a fun fact-shaped detail, it's the whole engine. He taught marine biology. He made a little educational comic called The Intertidal Zone to help teach it. And the characters in that comic were the ancestors of the ones we all know. He came at animation from the water, not the other way round. He first put the character together in the late 80s. The show, as we know it, got developed properly in 1996 and turned up on Nickelodeon in 1999. He died in 2018 at 57 after being diagnosed with ALS, which I still find genuinely rotten to think about, not least because he was still working on it. Here's why the biologist thing matters for a video about creepy episodes. If you ask an animator to design a sea creature, you tend to get something rounded off. Big eyes friendly, mammal adjacent. Sea creatures, as they exist in the imagination of someone who has mostly seen them in a tank. If you ask a marine biologist, you get what's actually down there. And what's down there is deeply peculiar. Anglerfish with a light on a stalk because there is no other light. Things that are transparent. Things with no eyes at all because eyes are a waste of resources at that depth. Filter feeders that look like plants and aren't. Creatures that reproduce in ways that would get a documentary a warning card. There's a whole strand of SpongeBob design that clearly comes from somebody who has spent time looking at real specimens and thought, well, that's already horrifying, I don't need to add anything. You see it in the background fish more than the main cast. The main cast are cartoons, but the crowd shots are full of things with the wrong number of fins or eyes on stalks or that unsettling flatness that real flatfish have. Realistic fish head, the one that's an actual photographic fish head that appears as a newsreader, is the joke version of this. And it works precisely because everyone in the audience immediately clocks that a real fish looks wrong in a cartoon. I'd argue that's the foundation everything else sits on. The show could always go strange without breaking because strange was baked into the source material. When a writer wanted to do a horror pastiche, they weren't fighting the world, they were leaning on it. One thing that always fascinated me is how little the show flags any of this. There's no wink. Nobody says, "Isn't the ocean odd?" It just is odd, constantly, in the background, while the plot is about a burger. Right? That's the groundwork. Let's talk about the one everybody thinks of first. Picture the Krusty Krab at 3 in the morning. Not the daytime version, with the cue and the noise and Squidward looking like he's calculating how many years he has left. The night version. Empty booths, that green neon sign outside that reads "Open Forever," which is a joke about Mr. Krabs' greed and also, if you look at it for slightly too long, a ominous sentence. The lighting in this episode is doing a lot of quiet work before anybody says anything scary. Everything's a bit blue, the windows are black, there's rain. The show almost never does weather like that, and when it does, you notice. That's Graveyard Shift Season 2. It aired in the States on the 6th of September 2002, though it was copyrighted the year before, and had already turned up in Canada the previous January, which is one of those scheduling oddities that makes fans argue about running orders. The credits list it as 2000 incorrectly, along with its sister episode, which is a nice little error to have preserved forever. The setup is simple enough. Krabs decides the restaurant should be open around the clock to make more money. Squidward is stuck there overnight with SpongeBob, who is delighted because of course he is. And Squidward, out of pure boredom and spite, decides to invent a ghost story. The hash-slinging slasher. Now the writing here is the thing I want to talk about, because it's cleverer than people give it credit for. Squidward isn't telling a story about a monster. He's telling a story about warnings. He says when the hash-slinging slasher arrives, first the lights will flicker, then the phone will ring, and there'll be nobody on the other end. And then he'll pull up in a bus made of bones. That's the trick. He hasn't described anything frightening. He's described a checklist, and a checklist is far worse, because now the audience, and SpongeBob, and eventually Squidward himself, is just sat there waiting to see if the boxes get ticked. Which they do, one at a time. The lights flicker, the phone rings and there's nobody there. And then headlights swing across the window. What I love is how the episode keeps puncturing itself while it does this. Squidward is halfway through the scariest part of his own story when a customer wanders up and asks for ketchup packets. He deals with the ketchup, then he resumes. Later, he interrupts himself to ask what day it is, purely so he can say the slasher returns on Tuesday nights. It's the rhythm of somebody making it up as they go, and the show never lets you forget that's what's happening, right up until it stops mattering whether he made it up. There's a moment I've always thought was the actual scariest bit, and it isn't the monster, is when green slime starts oozing down the walls of the kitchen. No explanation, no gag attached, it just happens, and then it's over. That's a direct reference to the 1979 version of the Amityville Horror, where blood comes down the walls of the house. Somebody on that crew watched a lot of 70s horror and slipped it in where it would land on a generation of children who had absolutely no idea what they were looking at. The episode was written by Mr. Lawrence, Jay Lender, and Dan Povenmire. If Povenmire's name rings a bell, that's because he went on to make Phineas and Ferb. Lender and Povenmire also handled the storyboard directing, and Sean Dempsey directed the animation. And here's the bit of production history I find most enjoyable in the entire show. There was originally a different ending. In the storyboards, there's a character sometimes referred to as Floorboard Harry, who was going to be the one flicking the lights on and off the whole time. That got dropped, so Lender needed a replacement, some absurd non sequitur to close on. What he reached for was a memory from his own childhood. He'd seen an image of Count Orlok, the vampire from the 1922 silent film Nosferatu, in the magazine Famous Monsters of Filmland. That image had lodged itself somewhere in his head and never left. So when he needed a horror non sequitur, he said, it was already sitting in that slot in his brain. He pitched it to Hillenburg. Hillenburg said yes. Lender then had to actually find the image. He went looking for books he could scan, and in the end he pulled it off the internet, which in the early 2000s was not the resource it is now. He described it as searching what little there was of the web back then. So the ending of one of the most famous episodes of the biggest cartoon of the decade exists, because a man managed to find a decent JPEG of a 100-year-old German vampire. There's a quote from Lender about working there that I think about a lot. He said Steve gave you the opportunities to do things that would really be memorable if you could sell him on it. That's a whole management philosophy in one sentence, and you can see the results of it scattered across 4 seasons. One more detail, because it's my favourite kind of detail. Lender knew perfectly well that the vampire's name wasn't Nosferatu. Nosferatu is the title of the film. The character is Count Orlok. He used the wrong name deliberately, because it was more recognisable, and because it sounded funnier delivered in that sing-song way. Which it does. Nosferatu, said cheerfully, is a much better joke than Count Orlok said accurately. The result is that an entire generation can identify Max Schreck standing in a doorway with his fingers up, and a decent proportion of them have never seen a frame of the actual film. That's a strange kind of cultural transmission. A silent horror film from a century ago survives in the public memory, partly because it was used as a punchline about a light switch. So, do I think the ending ruins it? No. And I'll go further, I think it's the reason the episode holds up, because the horror in Graveyard Shift is a lie the whole way through. Squidward makes the slasher up. The flickering lights turn out to be a vampire messing about. The phone call turns out to be a nervous bloke, ringing about a job and hanging up. The bus is just a bus. Nothing supernatural is stalking the Krusty Krab. Everything that scared them had a boring explanation, and it scared them anyway, because they'd been handed a checklist and told what to look for. That's a genuinely sharp idea about how fear works, and it's sitting in an 11-minute cartoon between a segment about ketchup and one about Mrs. Puff. There's one more thing this episode gave the internet, which is Patrick, appearing at the door for no reason, being told what time it is and shouting about it. Oh boy, 3 a.m. That line has outlived most of the episode's plot in terms of pure circulation. It's on shirts. It's the caption on every insomnia post ever made. Patrick isn't even in most of this episode. He turns up, has a moment of unearned joy, and leaves. Which is, if we're honest, the most Patrick contribution imaginable. Right, since we're on the subject of characters ending up somewhere they don't belong at an hour they shouldn't be awake, let's talk about buses. Since we're on the Krusty Krab, there are 2 more episodes set in and around it that belong in this conversation, and they're both about the same thing. Characters convinced somebody has died who hasn't. The first is Dying for Pie. The premise is that Squidward, forced into a workplace friendship exercise, buys SpongeBob a pie from a group of pirates. Then he's told the pie is a bomb. Then SpongeBob eats it. So Squidward believes he has, through carelessness, given his colleague a few hours to live. And what he does with that information is the episode. He decides to give SpongeBob the best day of his life. He takes him out. He plays along with everything. He agrees to things he would never normally agree to. The karaoke, the sandcastle, the whole horrible parade of activities SpongeBob has been suggesting for years and being turned down on. It is, on paper, quite sweet. Squidward being kind because he thinks the clock is running. But the episode plays it as horror from Squidward's side, and that's what makes it sit here. Because the entire time he's smiling and going along with it, he's watching, waiting for the moment. Every time SpongeBob trips or hiccups, Squidward flinches. There's a low-level dread running under a montage of fun, which is an odd tonal combination, and the show holds it for the whole runtime. And then the reveal, which I still think is the meanest joke in the series. The pie was real. It would have gone off. But SpongeBob is a sponge, and sponges are porous, and it passed through him without ever being digested. So it's still active, and it's inside him. The last stretch of the episode is Squidward trying to keep SpongeBob absolutely still and calm while he works out what to do, which is like trying to keep a wasp still. It ends with the pie going off in Squidward's face. Everyone lives. Squidward's day is ruined, order restored. What I like about it is the shape of the thing. Squidward is only decent to SpongeBob when he thinks it costs him nothing long term. The moment the death sentence is lifted, he goes straight back to being awful. The episode never says that out loud. It doesn't need to. The second one is much earlier and much sillier and, I'd argue, creepier in the moment. Squidward, the unfriendly ghost. SpongeBob and Patrick knock over what they think is Squidward. It's actually a wax replica of him. Sitting near a heater, by the time they get to it, it's a puddle on the floor. So they've killed him. Obviously, they've killed him. There's a Squidward-coloured puddle on the ground and no Squidward. And then he walks out of the bathroom, covered head to foot in white talcum powder. That image is the thing. A pale, blank powdered figure emerging into a room where 2 people are already halfway through processing his death. And they scream, because of course they do. What follows is Squidward realising what's happened and deciding immediately and with total commitment to exploit it. He is a ghost now. He has unfinished business. His unfinished business is that he requires them to build him a house, cook him meals, and generally serve him for the rest of his afterlife. The comedy is that he's a terrible ghost. He keeps over-explaining. He gets greedy. He can't stop pushing. But I want to give the show credit for the first 30 seconds. Because before it becomes a con man story, it's a well-staged reveal. The lighting, the pause before he comes into frame. The fact that he doesn't say anything at first. Somebody storyboarded that with a straight face. There's also the detail that Squidward's first instinct on being mistaken for the dead isn't fear or confusion. It's opportunity, which tells you everything about the character in about 4 seconds of screen time. 2 episodes, then, about mistaken death. One where the horror comes from believing you've caused it, one where it comes from being on the receiving end of the assumption. Neither has a ghost in it. Both are among the most memorable early episodes the show made. There's a pattern in that, and it's going to keep coming up. This show is far more interested in what people do when they think something terrible has happened than in anything terrible happening. Mr. Lawrence got on the wrong bus once, coming home from school. That's it. That's where rock bottom comes from. A kid who ended up somewhere he didn't recognise because he got on the wrong bus, and the specific flavour of dread that produces when you're 9, not danger exactly, just the floor going out from under the assumption that you know where you are. The episode aired on the 15th of March 2000, near the end of the first season. It was written by Paul Tibbett, Ennio Torreson and David Fain, with Tom Yasumi directing the animation. Tibbett and Torreson also handled the storyboards. Meriwether Williams, who was head writer on that first season, said the story was, in her words, so simple. She rated it as one of the best because it stayed with one idea. She described the whole thing as being about how SpongeBob keeps missing the bus and how that makes him feel. That's the entire brief, not a plot, a feeling. And she said something about the process I think is worth passing on, which is that a good outline in that room was one where the storyboard artist could just go and be funny. Her job, as she put it, was to create situations where the board guys could be funny. Set the trap, let them fill it. You can feel that in Rock Bottom because the gags escalate in a way that doesn't feel written so much as discovered. Now, what actually makes it unsettling? Rock Bottom is a trench. It's the deep sea, the properly deep sea, the part where sunlight has given up. SpongeBob and Patrick take the wrong bus home from Gloveworld. This is the first time we ever see Gloveworld, incidentally, and Patrick makes it back onto a bus while SpongeBob doesn't. So he's stuck, alone, in a town where everything is slightly wrong. The residents speak a language that involves flapping their tongues, which SpongeBob cannot do and cannot learn. Nobody is hostile to him. That's important. There's no villain in Rock Bottom. Everyone is perfectly pleasant. They simply cannot be understood, and he cannot make himself understood back, and the effect of that is worse than any monster would be. The bus timetable is unreadable. The vending machine takes his money and gives him nothing until it eventually buries him in a landslide of snack bars. The buses arrive and leave without warning. Every time he thinks he's cracked the system changes. And the lighting. Everything down there is dark blue and black, and the only things you can see clearly are the glowing bits, the little lures, the eyes. There's a stretch where the lights go out entirely in the bus station, and all you get is dozens of pairs of eyes turning to look at him. The show does not linger on it. It's a couple of seconds. It's the couple of seconds everybody remembers. The alternate titles they were kicking around are worth mentioning here, because they show what the crew thought they were making. One was The Wrong Bus, one was Just the Bus, and one was It's Lonely at the Bottom, which is the one that names the thing. Because that's what it is. It's a loneliness episode with an anglerfish in it. I'd put it in the same family as being a kid at a train station in a foreign country when your phone's dead. Nobody's going to hurt you. You're just, for the moment, entirely outside the system, and everyone around you is fine. And that's somehow the worst part. Now let's talk about a different kind of alone. SB 129. And straight away, the title is doing something odd, because SB 129 isn't a title. It's the production code. 29th episode in the production order. Somebody typed the file name into the title card slot, and everybody looked at it and thought, yeah, keep it. It went out on the very last day of December. Last day of the year, last day of the century, depending on how pedantic you're feeling. There's no way that wasn't deliberate, given what the episode is about. It was also the first time Aaron Springer worked as a storyboard director rather than a storyboard artist, which is a decent way to start. The working title before the production code stuck was SpongeBob 3000. And according to Nick Jennings, the original version had SpongeBob and Patrick doing the time travelling, not Squidward. That got changed. I have no idea why, and neither, as far as I can tell, does anyone else. But the change is what makes the episode work, because the whole thing only lands if the traveller is somebody who wants to be left alone. Tom Kenny has called it the most surreal episode of the series. He would know. The premise? Squidward, trying to escape SpongeBob, and Patrick asking him to go jellyfishing, hides in the crusty crab freezer. He gets stuck. He assumes somebody will notice. Nobody notices. For 2,000 years. He thaws out in a chrome future full of SpongeBob clones, where a calendar on the wall reads the 6th of March, 4017, which, if you do the subtraction, dates the present-day scenes to March 2017, a date that was comfortably in the future when the episode aired, and is now comfortably in the past. That's an accidental time capsule, and I enjoy it enormously. Then he finds a time machine, overshoots in the other direction, and ends up in the prehistoric era with primitive versions of SpongeBob and Patrick, who are exactly as annoying as the modern ones, with fewer words available. And then he breaks it. This is the part people actually remember. He damages the machine and ends up nowhere. Not a place, there is no place. It's a white void with nothing in it. No matter, no life, no flaw, nothing to look at. And his first reaction is joy. That's the detail that gets me. He's finally alone, which is the thing he has claimed to want in every episode up to this point. And for a few seconds, he's thrilled about it. Then the voices start, disembodied, overlapping, saying one word, alone. Those voices, by the way, were the show's own crew. Everyone in the building recorded and layered up, which somehow makes it worse rather than better. The way the episode ends is a proper piece of construction, and I'll explain it once and then leave it alone. Squidward eventually gets back to the prehistoric past, gets fed up with the ancestors messing about with a jellyfish, and shows them how to do it properly, how to catch it in a net. He invents jellyfishing. The thing he spent the entire episode running away from is the thing he created, and the reason he had to travel through time in the first place. The loop has no starting point. It's called a bootstrap paradox, and this was the first time the show did one. He gets home, SpongeBob and Patrick tell him cheerfully that he invented jellyfishing. He says he wants to go back in time and stop himself. He immediately gets his clarinet stuck in his throat again. No lesson, no resolution. Just a man who has travelled 4,000 years to arrive precisely where he started, slightly worse off. I think that's the funniest bleak ending in the show, and it's in the first season. 2 episodes about panic now, both from early on, both built on the same engine. The residents of Bikini Bottom convincing themselves of something completely untrue, and then acting on it with total conviction. Wormy first. Sandy goes away and leaves SpongeBob and Patrick in charge of her pets. Among them is a caterpillar called Wormy, who is small and green and friendly, and gets handled a lot. Overnight, Wormy pupates. And in the morning, what's in the enclosure is a butterfly. Enormous, from their perspective. Compound eyes, long curling proboscis, wings the size of a room. The show animates it realistically. That's the whole trick, and it's brilliant. Everything else on screen is a cartoon, round, soft, 4 fingers, big pupils. The butterfly is drawn like a nature documentary. Textured wings, segmented body, that horrible twitchy insect movement. And SpongeBob and Patrick have no idea what metamorphosis is. So what they see is, our friend is gone, and this thing is in his place. The panic that follows is a small masterpiece of escalation. They run, they warn people, the town takes them seriously. There's a montage of Bikini Bottom in full civil emergency over a butterfly that is, from its own point of view, having a lovely day. The bit that gets me is the perspective work. The episode keeps cutting to what the characters see, the butterfly looming, the proboscis unrolling towards them like something out of a creature feature, and it's all accurate. It's exactly what a butterfly does. Nothing has been exaggerated except the framing. The monster is a butterfly. The horror is entirely in the camera. And there's a lovely payoff when Sandy comes back. sees the chaos, and just says the obvious thing: caterpillars turn into butterflies. Everyone stares. Somebody has been terrorizing the town all afternoon on the basis of not having done Key Stage 2 biology. There's a detail in the middle of it I always enjoy. SpongeBob writes a warning note. He is trying to alert the public to a threat, and the note he produces is about as useful as you'd expect from somebody who is currently the most frightened person in the ocean. Nobody in this episode communicates well. That's half of what keeps it moving, and Patrick spends the whole thing agreeing with whatever the last thing said to him was, which is exactly how these panics work in real life. One person is certain, everyone else is going along with it. By the time anybody thinks to check, the town has already boarded up the windows. Sandy's rocket is the other one, and it's got a nastier edge than people remember. Sandy builds a rocket. SpongeBob and Patrick, uninvited, get in it and launch. They fly about a bit, come back down, and land in Bikini Bottom. But they've convinced themselves they're on the moon. So everyone they see is an alien. They've got a book about aliens. They've got a net. And they work through the town methodically, capturing everyone they meet, bagging them up, and stashing them in the rocket. Read back like that, it's slightly horrifying, and the episode does very little to soften it. There's no moment where a character says, "Hang on, this is my neighbour." They see Squidward and see an alien. They see Mr. Krabs and see an alien. Every familiar face gets processed as a specimen. There's a scene where they check each other with the alien detection book, and each becomes convinced the other one is an imposter, which is the oldest paranoia plot in science fiction, the body snatcher structure, where the horror isn't the invader, but the impossibility of proving you're yourself. They resolve it eventually, and everyone gets released, and there's an ending gag about actual aliens that I won't spoil because it's better cold. But the middle stretch of that episode is 50% of the thing performed by a sponge and a starfish with a butterfly net, and I don't think it gets enough recognition for that. Same trick as the ghost story earlier. Then, in both of these, a caterpillar does what caterpillars do. Two idiots land in their own town. I'd say that's the show's signature move in this territory. It's not a horror show. It's a show about people being wrong, filmed like a horror show. And it can only do that because the town is small enough that a rumour reaches everybody by lunchtime, which is a thing the writers understood about Bikini Bottom very early on and used constantly. There's a grave in Bikini Bottom with a headstone that reads, "Squidward's Hopes and Dreams." Squidward visits it, he brings flowers, he stands there weeping. It's a background gag. It happens in the corner of the frame while the actual plot is going on elsewhere, and the episode does not stop to acknowledge it. Mr. Krabs walks past him. That's all. Later, at the end, Squidward wanders back through with more flowers, sees Krabs sobbing on the ground and says, "What a baby." I've never fully recovered from that gag, and I don't think I'm supposed to. The episode is one Krabs trash, and the plot around it is very silly, which is exactly why the graveyard stuff hits as hard as it does. Krabs holds a yard sale. SpongeBob buys a soda drinking hat, one of those novelty things with 2 bottles and straws, and he loves it. Then some collectors turn up and tell Krabs the hat is worth $1 million, so Krabs needs it back. He tries insults. He tries offering SpongeBob a bag of other hats. Neither works because SpongeBob's attachment to the hat is genuine, and Krabs has no framework for understanding that. So at night, he draws a ghost on a piece of paper, hangs it off a fishing rod, and dangles it outside SpongeBob's window. The gag that follows is one of the better bits of writing in Season 2. SpongeBob wakes up, looks at the paper, and says it's a floating shopping list because Krabs has drawn the ghost on the back of an actual shopping list, and the writing is facing the wrong way. Krabs has to look at his own prop, read the words milk, eggs, bread, and insist he is not a shopping list. Then he improvises. He announces that the hat belonged to somebody who has died and must be returned. SpongeBob asks who, and Krabs, put on the spot, invents a name: Smitty Verbenjäger Manjensen. That name is one of the show's greatest accidents. It's obviously nonsense. It's a man panicking and stacking syllables, and the joke is meant to end there. Except SpongeBob comes back the next day and says he's returned the hat to the grave of the real Smitty Verben Jagermanjensen, who exists, who is buried in the local cemetery under an enormous headstone that says he was number 1. Krabs has invented at random the name of an actual dead person, which means he now has to go and dig him up. And this is where a children's cartoon commits fully to a graveyard sequence. Krabs goes out at night, finds the grave, opens it, takes the hat off the skull, and the skeleton sits up and asks for it back. Politely at first. Krabs tells him to crawl back in his hole and play dead. So Smitty raises the rest of the cemetery. There's an army of skeletons. Krabs fights them off using the head of an undead swordfish as a sword. It goes on for a while. It's genuinely well animated and there's no comedy safety net under it. Nobody wakes up. It's not a dream. This is just happening. One detail I love, the headstone gets the name wrong. It reads Smitty Werbenman Jensen. The Jager is missing. Whether that was a mistake or a joke about how nobody could spell it, I've never been able to establish. And at this point, I'd rather not know. And then the ending, which is the cruel part. Krabs gets back with the hat, having desecrated a grave and fought the dead. And the collectors tell him they've just found a warehouse full of identical hats. It's worth nothing. They then spot SpongeBob wearing a different novelty hat and chase him instead. So, grave robbery, skeleton combat, and the reward is 0. That's the shape of most Mr. Krabs episodes, but rarely with this body count. Since we're on the subject of Krabs losing his mind, let's do the other one. Squeaky Boots is early. First season, and it's the show doing Edgar Allan Poe almost completely straight. The setup. Krabs gets stuck with a pair of boots he can't sell. He gives them to SpongeBob as a wage substitute, because he's Krabs. SpongeBob adores them. They squeak. And that's the episode. They squeak constantly, everywhere. And Krabs cannot get away from the noise. It follows him around the restaurant. It follows him home. It gets into his head, and once it's in his head, it doesn't need the boots to be present anymore. If you've read The Telltale Heart, you know precisely where this goes, because it goes there. A man is tormented by a sound only he seems bothered by. The sound gets louder. His behaviour gets stranger. And eventually he cracks and confesses to something nobody was even accusing him of, purely to make it stop. Krabs ends up tearing up the floorboards. He digs the boots out from where he buried them. And then, in front of everyone, he confesses. Poe's narrator does exactly the same thing, under the floor of exactly the same kind of room. What gets me about it is how little the episode does to soften the ending. Krabs isn't punished. He isn't forgiven, really. He's just exposed as a man who has been driven to the edge by footwear, and everyone stares at him. A cartoon aimed at 7-year-olds, adapting one of the most famous stories about guilt in the English language, using squeaky boots as the heartbeat. I don't know what else to say about that. No notes. There's a version of this show that gets described as randomness, and it always slightly annoys me, because this isn't random at all. Somebody in that room knew the Poe story well enough to reproduce its structure beat for beat. That's not chaos. That's a writer with a bookshelf. Right, let's do illness and sleep deprivation, because the show has one strong episode about each and they're both quietly grim. Suds is the illness one. SpongeBob catches something. It's called the Suds, and what it does is make him blow bubbles out of his holes when he sneezes and turn a rather ill shade of blue-grey. The plot is that he needs to see a doctor and doesn't want to because he's frightened of the surgery. So Sandy and Patrick try to get him there, and Patrick, being Patrick, decides the compassionate move is to pretend to be a doctor himself and treat SpongeBob at home. The bit everybody remembers is Patrick's medical practice. He builds a fake surgery, he wears the coat, and his treatments are essentially torture delivered with total sincerity. He hits SpongeBob with things, He wraps him in bandages until he can't move. He administers procedures with no basis in anything. It's played for comedy, and it is funny, but there's a genuine discomfort under it, because SpongeBob is actually ill, and getting worse, and the person helping him has no idea what he's doing and cannot be reasoned with. That's a specific and quite real kind of nightmare, being unwell and dependent on someone who is confidently incompetent. What tips it over for me is how the show draws sickness. SpongeBob's colour drains, his eyes go glassy. He gets that heavy, slow movement that ill people have. The animation team clearly decided not to cheat it, and the result is that half the episode looks like somebody unwell being messed about with. The ending is fine. He gets to the doctor, the treatment is one small painless thing, and Patrick is horrified to learn how simple it was. But you sit through a fair amount of real discomfort to get there. I'd also point out, and this feeds into something we'll come back to, that the show is drawn to physical vulnerability far more than it's drawn to monsters. The body going wrong is the recurring anxiety, not ghosts. Fear of a Krabby Patty is the sleep one, and it's odd in a way that's hard to describe if you haven't seen it. Plankton comes up with a scheme. Get the Krusty Krab to open 24 hours a day so that SpongeBob, who never stops working, is worked into collapse. We've been here before, obviously, the night shift is well-trodden ground for this show, but where the earlier version was about boredom and ghost stories, this one is about exhaustion. It's a much more physical episode. SpongeBob doesn't sleep. He doesn't get to. And the show renders that with genuine unpleasantness. The bags under the eyes, the flat voice, the slack posture, the 1,000-yard stare. He keeps flipping patties long after any reason to keep flipping patties has evaporated, and then he develops a phobia. He can't look at a Krabby Patty anymore. The thing he loves most in the world has become the thing he can't bear, purely through overexposure. The animation of the patties themselves changes to match. They go from the clean, appetizing design the show has used for years to something bulging and wrong, leering, snapping with faces. There's a dream sequence built around it that goes strange. And the treatment for the phobia is hypnotherapy, delivered by a therapist who is not exactly reliable, which sends the episode into a long stretch of dream logic, where SpongeBob is regressed and things stop making sense in the specific way that dreams don't make sense. I have complicated feelings about this one. Parts of it are the show at its most inventive. Parts of it are a bit shapeless. But the central image, somebody worked so hard that the thing they love turns monstrous, is one of the more pointed ideas the series ever put on screen. And I don't think it was accidental. Because if you've watched enough of this show, you'll have noticed that SpongeBob's relationship with his job is the running joke that stopped being a joke somewhere around season 3. He's the only person in Bikini Bottom who wants to be at work. He's paid badly by a man who openly does not value him. He treats his employment as an identity. Every so often, an episode looks directly at that and gets slightly uncomfortable about it. This is one of those episodes. There's also a small detail worth flagging. The 24-hour opening trick is a plot the show used more than once, and both times it goes wrong, and both times it's Krabs' greed that starts it. That's not a coincidence. That's a writer's room with a consistent view of the character. Nasty Patty is the one where the two leads spend most of the runtime believing they've killed a man. Season 3. It went out on the 1st of March, 2002, produced the year before, and it was the first episode written by Kaz, a comics writer who'd come over to the show and immediately turned in this. The setup is a misunderstanding, which is important, because everything that follows is technically nobody's fault and entirely everybody's fault. A health inspector turns up at the Krusty Krab. He's real. He asks for everything on the menu because that's how the job works. Then a news report comes on saying there's a man going round impersonating a health inspector to get free food. Krabs, being Krabs, does not consider the odds. he decides the man eating his stock is the imposter, and he decides to punish him. SpongeBob suggests, reasonably, that they could just ask him. Krabs is not interested in asking, so they build the nasty patty. The ingredient list is one of those things that reads worse the slower you go through it. Volcano sauce, seahorse radish, a jar of Mr. Krabs' toenail clippings. Then SpongeBob drops it in the toilet. Then Krabs dries it off with an old gym sock. There's a moment where the finished patty is shown in close-up, and the design is a real departure. It's drawn in this lumpy, veined, warty style that looks nothing like the show's usual clean line. People have compared it to the work of Basil Wolverton, the illustrator with the famously grotesque faces. And once you've heard that comparison, you can't unhear it. Then the actual gag, which is that the plan fails immediately, and by accident. The inspector never eats it. A fly goes in his mouth, he chokes, he drops the patty, he slips on it, he cracks his head on the table, and goes out cold. And SpongeBob and Krabs are in the kitchen, laughing, watching him writhe about, thinking their revenge has worked. Then the second news report comes on. The imposter has been arrested. The man on the floor of their restaurant is the real health inspector. What follows is about 6 straight minutes of 2 characters trying to dispose of a body, and I want to be clear about how far the episode takes it. They carry him out. They bury him on a hill. SpongeBob leaves the head sticking out of the soil, and when Krabs asks why, he says he thought he might need some air. It rains. The hill erodes. The body comes back up. They move him into the walk-in freezer. Then 2 police officers arrive. Then one of them wants ice for her drink and heads for the freezer, and the 2 of them crack and confess to everything. She opens the freezer. It's empty. She assumes it's a joke and closes the door, and then the inspector walks up behind them, concussed and confused, and the police draw on him because they think he's a zombie. It ends fine. He was never dead. The Krusty Krab passes its inspection. Krabs celebrates by giving everyone a small discount because he is incapable of generosity. You'll see this one listed as banned in a few places. There are claims about it being pulled from certain broadcasts for being too frightening. I've seen those repeated a lot, and I haven't been able to nail down a source I'd stand behind, so I'll put it the honest way. It's a widely repeated claim, and it's the sort of episode you can absolutely imagine a broadcaster having second thoughts about. But I'm not going to state it as fact. What I will say is that the French dub retitled it, and the title translates to something close to killers in spite of themselves, which suggests at least one localization team looked at this and thought, well, we know what this is about. The reason it works, for me, is that the horror is entirely social. Same trick as the ghost story earlier, different setting. The dread is just 2 people who have done a stupid thing and are now watching the consequences arrive slowly and inevitably, in the rain with a shovel. And now, since we're on gross, let's talk about the other one. Though I'm going to handle this differently, because the plot doesn't matter and the reaction does. The Splinter came out in 2008, season 6. SpongeBob gets a splinter in his thumb. He hides it. He keeps working. That's the whole episode. There's no ghost, no monster, no graveyard, and it regularly turns up on lists like this one, which I think is worth interrogating rather than just accepting. Because I'd argue it isn't a creepy episode at all. It's a disgusting one. Those aren't the same thing, and the difference matters. Everything else we've talked about tonight uses dread, the sense that something is coming, or that the world has stopped behaving properly. The Splinter has no dread in it. It has close-ups, it has swelling, and colour changes, and the sound design doing things you can feel in your own hand. There's a shot near the end that people describe with the same tone they use for actual horror films, and it's just a wound. The interesting thing to me is what it represents in the show's history. The Splinter is the episode people point at when they want to mark the moment the humour changed, when the grossness stopped being cartoonish and started being anatomical. Whether that's fair is another question. The show had done bodily comedy from the start, but the earlier version had a bounce to it. This doesn't bounce, it lingers. I'll be honest and say I don't love it. Not because it's too much for me, I'm a grown adult, I'll cope, but because it's boring in a way the others aren't. Once you've established that her thumb looks horrible, there's nowhere to go but a bigger close-up. But I'll give it this, it's the only episode on this list where I've seen people say they physically had to look away, and none of the ghost episodes manage that. So it's doing something. I just don't think what it's doing is creepy. Which is a useful line to have drawn actually, because the next two episodes are properly creepy, and the difference is going to be obvious. There's a habit among people who talk about this show of pretending it stopped being interesting after season 3. I understand where that comes from, and I'm not going to pretend the average later episode is as good as the average early one. But the horror material holds up quite well across the whole run, and there are a few later episodes that deserve a mention here. Planet of the Jellyfish is the most straightforwardly frightening thing the show has done in its later years. The setup is body snatchers, played almost entirely straight. There's a jellyfish, a specific, unusual one, that produces duplicates of people. Perfect copies. Same voice, same face, same mannerisms, and they replace everybody. SpongeBob works it out slowly, which is the right pace for this. He notices small things, somebody says the wrong thing, somebody's timing is off, and then he's alone in a town full of people who look exactly like his friends and are not his friends, and there's no way to tell by looking. The show commits. There's no comedy escape hatch for a long stretch of it. There's a sequence where the duplicates move as a group, in silence, and it's shot like a proper horror film. The low angles, the slow approach, the crowd closing in. What makes it land is that the show has spent hundreds of episodes making you familiar with exactly how these characters move and sound. So when a copy does it slightly wrong, you feel it before you can name it. That's an advantage a long-running series has that a horror film never will. It can spend a decade building your instincts and then violate them in 11 minutes. I genuinely recommend it to people who think the show lost its nerve. It didn't. It just got less consistent. Ghoul Fools is the haunted ship one, and it's a proper Halloween special in structure. Longer runtime, bigger cast, a real setting to explore. A ghost ship arrives above Bikini Bottom, and SpongeBob and Patrick go up to have a look. And the ship is well designed. It's rotten and organic, and full of things that shouldn't be there. And the episode takes its time wandering around inside it rather than rushing to a plot. It leans on classic haunted house architecture, corridors that go on too long, rooms that don't connect the way they should, doors that open onto something that isn't a room. There's a whole sequence involving a lift going down further than it should be able to, and then the Flying Dutchman turns up, which we've covered. So I'll just say he's operating in full menace mode here, rather than in his sitcom lodger mode. The reason I bring it up is the art direction. There's a real difference between an episode where somebody says, let's do a spooky one, and an episode where a background team has clearly enjoyed themselves. Ghoul Fools is the second kind. The colour palette drops out entirely. Everything's greens and sick yellows and black, and the show almost never looks like that. Don't look. Now I want to come at from a single shot. There's a moment in it where a shadow falls across a wall. That's all. A shape. A wall. No music sting. No reaction cut. And it's held for slightly longer than a comedy would ever hold it. About a second and a half past comfortable. That's the whole technique of the episode. Not what's on screen. How long you're made to look at it. The plot around it is thin on purpose. SpongeBob and Patrick watch a horror film about a fisherman who abducts sea creatures, decide the fisherman is coming for them, and spend the rest of the runtime barricading the pineapple and listening. Every ordinary house noise becomes evidence. It's a home invasion thriller performed by two people who are, once again, the only threat present. I'd call it the most efficient of the three. It knows it has one good idea and it doesn't pad. I'd put all three of these in the same bracket. Episodes that know exactly which horror subgenre they're doing and execute it properly, with jokes layered on top rather than used as an escape route. That's the distinction I keep coming back to. A lot of cartoons do a Halloween episode where everything spooky turns out to be a misunderstanding and the tone never actually drops. This show is willing to let the tone drop. It'll sit in the unpleasant register for a full minute before it lets you off. That's rare, and it's why these episodes stuck with people who watch them at 7. Here's a thing that surprises people when they check the dates. I Was a Teenage Gary went out on the 28th of October, 1999. The show had been on air for a matter of months. It was still establishing what it was, and what it decided to do that early was full-blown body horror with no cure at the end. The setup is domestic. SpongeBob goes away for the weekend and asks Squidward to feed Gary. Squidward, who does not care, does not feed Gary. Gary gets ill. By the time SpongeBob comes back, the snail is grey and limp, and clearly in a bad way, and this bit is played completely straight. No jokes, no undercutting. A pet has been neglected and is suffering. For a few minutes the episode is just sad. The fix is snail plasma administered by syringe. And in the scuffle, Squidward accidentally injects SpongeBob instead. What follows is a transformation sequence that has no business being in a Nickelodeon show from that first season. It happens slowly. SpongeBob's eyes go first. They migrate up onto stalks. His voice goes. His mouth changes shape. A shell comes through, and the whole time he's trying to talk, and what comes out is meowing. The animation understands exactly what it's doing. It doesn't cut away. It holds on his face while the face stops being his. And then he chases Squidward because he's still trying to communicate and he doesn't know how anymore. And Squidward runs from him through the house in the dark. And it is filmed like a horror pursuit, which, in fairness, is what it is. Somebody you know is coming down the corridor and they aren't themselves, and they want something from you, and you can't understand what. Then Squidward gets injected too, and that's the ending. All three of them, Gary, SpongeBob, Squidward, sitting on the garden fence meowing at the moon. No cure, no reset, nobody turns back. The next episode simply proceeds as though this never happened, which is standard cartoon practice, but it means the last image of this particular story is 3 characters permanently transformed, singing. I think this is the single strangest ending in the first season, and it's competing with a squid inventing a hobby in the Precambrian. What makes it land is the setup, because the reason it happens is neglect. Squidward couldn't be bothered to feed a snail. That's it. That's the whole causal chain. There's no villain, no curse, no monster, just somebody not doing a small kind thing, and then the world coming apart in a very specific and irreversible way, which is, if you squint, a much more frightening moral than most horror manages. Now something with a similar shape, but a completely different feel. Frankendoodle, SpongeBob and Patrick find a pencil, not a normal one that's fallen from a boat above, so it's enormous by their standards, and it draws things that become real. SpongeBob draws a fish, it swims off. He draws a bag of money for Krabs, who is delighted right up until it dissolves. And then he draws himself. Badly. That's the important bit. He draws himself the way you doodle in the margin of a maths book. Crooked lines, wobbly eyes, mouth in the wrong place. And he sends it round to prank Squidward. Doodlebob does not do a prank. Doodlebob beats Squidward up. The voice, by the way, was Paul Tirbett, the writer and eventual showrunner, who also worked on Rock Bottom. He does this strangled, back-of-the-throat gibberish, and out of it emerges that line everybody can quote and nobody can spell. Me hoi minoi, nobody has ever satisfactorily explained what it means. Tibbet has been asked, and I don't think he's ever given a straight answer, which I respect. What makes Doodlebob work as a horror creation is that he's two-dimensional in a world that's pretending to be three. The show's normal characters have shading and outlines and a consistent thickness. Doodlebob is a flat scribble on top of the frame, and he moves wrong. He jerks, he flickers, his lines wobble like they're being redrawn every frame. Because they are. There's a whole family of scary things that work on the same principle. Something that doesn't obey the visual rules, everything else obeys. Your brain flags it before you've consciously worked out why, and the fight is nasty by the show's standards. He's got a pencil. He can draw more of himself. He rips SpongeBob's face off at one point, which again, 2002 children's television. The way they beat him is the good bit. SpongeBob works out that the pencil's eraser is the only weapon that matters, and he uses it. And Doodlebob, mid-fight, understands what's happening to him. He watches his own leg disappear. He panics. Then in the final scene, SpongeBob draws him back onto a page in a book to keep him harmless, closes it, and everyone goes home. And the last shot is the closed book with Doodlebob's eyes moving inside it. He's still in there. He's still aware. He's just been filed. I'd argue that's the darkest ending on this list, and it's delivered as a gentle little button on a comedy. The show does that a lot, and I don't think it's an accident. There's a particular kind of confidence in ending on something quietly awful, and then just cutting to the credits music. Speaking of which, that credits music, and the whole business of where the show's sound comes from, is a proper rabbit hole. But I want to do one more group of episodes first, because there's a character who's been hovering around the edge of this video since the beginning, and he deserves his own section. I want to talk about the drawing itself for a bit, because there's a whole category of unsettling SpongeBob that has nothing to do with plot. You know the ones I mean. The close-ups. Every so often the show abandons its own house style entirely for a single shot. The clean outlines go. The flat colours go. And in their place you get something rendered in obsessive, horrible detail. Pores, veins, individual hairs, wet surfaces, teeth with actual texture on them. Held for 1 or 2 seconds. Then straight back to normal, as if nothing happened. There's a name people use for it now, but the technique predates the naming. It's been in the show since fairly early on, and it got much more frequent from the 4th season onwards. And it works for a specific reason, which is worth pulling apart. Cartoon faces are a kind of shorthand. 2 dots and a line, and your brain fills in a person. It's an agreement between the animator and the audience. We both know this isn't a real face, and we've agreed to treat it as one. The close-up breaks the agreement. Suddenly you're not looking at shorthand. You're looking at a rendering of what that shorthand would look like if it were a physical object, and what it would actually look like is a horror. It's the same principle as the butterfly we talked about, applied to the characters themselves. Nothing new has been added. Something has just been drawn accurately, and accuracy turns out to be the frightening part. The show leaned into this hard enough that it eventually built an entire episode around it, in which the characters' faces get stuck in whatever expression they're pulling. That episode is, depending on who you ask, either a great gag or 11 minutes of things you'd rather not see, and I'd say the truth is somewhere in the middle. The Squidward one is the worst. It's always the Squidward one, which brings me to something I've been circling all night, and I might as well name it. There is an entire category of this show that fans call the Squidward torture episodes. The formula is something Squidward wants is set up, and then the episode's job is to take it away from him in the most elaborate way possible, usually with SpongeBob as the unwitting instrument. He doesn't win. He isn't allowed to win. The comedy is the accumulation. Now in the early seasons this is fine because there's a balance to it. Squidward is petty and unkind, and the universe punishes him proportionally. He also gets episodes where he's the sympathetic one, and occasionally he gets a small victory. Later on, the balance goes, and you get episodes where nothing he does justifies what happens, and the show keeps going anyway, and the animation gets more detailed about the damage. I don't want to be the person who says the show got mean, because that's a slightly tired take, and it flattens a lot of good later episodes. But I'll say this, the reason some of these turn up on creepy lists isn't that they contain anything supernatural. It's that they cross a line from comic misfortune into something that reads as cruelty, and the audience notices even if they can't articulate it. There's a version of Squidward, the one in the void, the one at the grave with the flowers, the one who gets one good day of being genuinely decent because he thinks his colleague is dying, who is one of the better drawn, sad characters in television animation. And then there's the version who exists so that a toenail can come off. The first one is why people care about him. The second one is why some episodes feel wrong in a way that has nothing to do with ghosts. One last thought on the art, and this is a nicer one. The backgrounds in this show are painted, properly painted, in the early seasons especially. You can see brush texture in the rock formations and the coral. Nick Jennings ran the art direction, and the palette he set is a huge part of why Bikini Bottom feels like a real place rather than a stage, and that's why the horror episodes work visually. When everything is normally warm and orange and turquoise, dropping the palette to greens and blacks isn't a stylistic flourish, it's a genuine shock to the eye. You feel the temperature change before you register what's happening in the plot. That's the thing about a house style. You can only break it if you have one. The Flying Dutchman is the show's only actual ghost, not a fake one on a fishing line, not a bloke in a costume, not a rumour told to wind up a colleague. A genuine, established, recurring spirit who sails a ghost ship and collects souls in a sack. He's voiced by Brian Doyle Murray, which is a piece of casting I think about more than is reasonable. That voice gravelly, put upon, faintly Midwestern, attached to a green, glowing, bearded pirate wraith. It shouldn't work. It works completely. And what I find interesting about him is that he arrived in the show's first Halloween outing and was still turning up 18 years later in a stop-motion special. And across all that time, the writers kept finding new angles on the same joke. He is the most frightening thing in this world, and it is never quite enough. Let's take them roughly in order. Scaredy Pants. The same night as the Gary episode, incidentally, which makes that a fairly eventful evening of children's television. SpongeBob is tired of being the one who gets scared every Halloween, so he dresses up as the Flying Dutchman to frighten everybody else. Which works until the actual Flying Dutchman turns up, deeply offended by the impersonation, and the resolution is the joke that defines the character. The Dutchman goes inside SpongeBob's head to properly terrify him from within, and what he finds in there is a naked infant version of SpongeBob in a void, being extremely cheerful. He's so disturbed by it that he leaves. He releases the souls he'd taken and sails off. The ghost gets scared by the inside of a sponge's mind. That's the template, and they never really improve on it, because it's already perfect, shanghaied. This is the one where the Dutchman gets menacing, and it's also the episode with the famous production quirk. SpongeBob and Patrick end up aboard the ghost ship as his crew, and Squidward gets dragged in too. The Dutchman is not messing about here. This is the version of the character with actual power over the dead. And the episode has 3 different endings, 3 separate versions of who gets the Dutchman's wish and what they do with it. Which one aired properly was decided by a fan vote. So there's a canonical ending, technically, but all 3 exist and all 3 are on the DVDs, and the show has never really cleaned it up. I like that enormously. It's the kind of thing you could only get away with in a format where nothing carries over anyway. Ghost Host. This is my favourite of the lot, and it's the one that's least interested in being scary. The Dutchman's ship breaks down, so he moves in with SpongeBob while it's repaired. And he does what he does, he scares him. Constantly. Around the clock. Popping out of cupboards, materialising in the bathroom, the whole routine. And SpongeBob gets used to it. That's the plot. A ghost has an existential crisis because his lodger has stopped flinching. He becomes convinced he's lost his touch. He goes into a decline. He's a professional whose one professional skill has stopped working, and he takes it about as well as anyone would. The show sits somewhere between horror and workplace sitcom for 11 minutes, and it's one of the better character studies in the series. He ends up needing SpongeBob's help, the person he's meant to terrify, to get his confidence back. The plan involves Squidward, who claims not to believe in ghosts. There's something quite tender about it underneath, which is not a sentence I expected to write about a soul-collecting revenant. The Legend of Bikini Bottom, the 13th of October 2017, 18 years after Scaredy Pants, which is a long career for a joke. This one's a proper special, and it's stop motion. That was only the second time the show had done that, after the Christmas special a few years earlier. The animation was produced at Screen Novelties and directed by Mark Caballero and Seamus Walsh, two of the studio's founders, and they've said the style was drawn from the classic Rankin-based specials, the ones with the slightly stiff felt puppets that anyone who grew up with a December television schedule will recognise instantly. And that's an inspired choice, because those specials are warm and nostalgic, and also, if you look at them with adult eyes, slightly uncanny. The puppets don't blink properly. The eyes are glass. Turning that texture towards Halloween instead of Christmas gets you something that feels old and homemade and just a bit off, in a way that clean 2D animation can't manage. Mr. Lawrence wrote it. Doyle Murray came back for The Dutchman. The plot is the same engine as ever. The Dutchman decides Bikini Bottom isn't taking Halloween seriously enough and sets out to frighten everyone. And once again, SpongeBob's brain is the problem. There's a sequence inside his head that was storyboarded and animated by Sally Cruikshank, an independent animator with a very distinctive style, all melting shapes and bright acid colours, and it is, by some distance, the most visually unhinged 90 seconds the show has ever produced. There's also a musical number called The Scare Song, performed by the Dutchman's crew of pirate ghosts over a theme park ride. The ghosts are doing their absolute best. Patrick is appropriately terrified. SpongeBob giggles the whole way through, which brings the character full circle more or less. 18 years of a professional ghost failing to scare one specific sponge. One last thing on this, and it's a small piece of evidence I find quite satisfying. Nickelodeon itself has run a countdown of the show's spookiest scenes, their own list, and the picks are more or less the ones we've been going through tonight. The Dutchman's ghost ship, the hash-slinging slasher, the mutant snails, the skeleton army, the stop-motion ride. So this isn't a case of fans reading something into a children's cartoon that isn't there. The network knows exactly what it's got. It packages it up and puts it on in October, which I think is the correct attitude. The creepy episodes aren't a glitch in the show. They're one of the things it does well, and it has done them deliberately for a very long time, with people who knew their horror films. Since we're on the subject of things being frightening because they're accurate, I want to spend a bit of time on the real animals, because a lot of what unsettles people about this show is borrowed directly from the water. Start with the trench we visited earlier, the deep dark one where nobody could understand each other. Real trenches are like that. Below about 1,000 meters, sunlight has effectively stopped. There is no day. There is no color that isn't produced by something living. And a surprising proportion of what lives down there makes its own light, because if you can't see anything, being able to make a small amount of light is an enormous advantage. For hunting, for finding a mate, for confusing something that's trying to eat you. Anglerfish are the famous one. The lure on the front is a modified fin ray, with light-producing bacteria living inside it. The fish isn't making the light, it's keeping tenants. It dangles the thing in the dark and waits, which is, when you say it plainly, a hunting strategy based on being the only interesting thing in an empty room. I find that genuinely upsetting, and I'm not entirely sure why. I don't think it's a coincidence that the show reached for that image when it wanted to make a place feel wrong. It's already wrong, Somebody just had to draw it. Then there's the reproductive business, which I'll handle briefly because it's one of the strangest facts in biology. In several anglerfish species, the males are tiny, vastly smaller than the females, and their entire purpose is to find one. When they do, they attach and then they fuse. The male's body degrades into the female's, tissues joining up, until what's left is essentially a permanent attachment, providing sperm on demand. A cartoon would not get away with inventing that. It would be sent back with notes. Sponges are worth a moment too, given the lead. A sponge is an animal which people are often surprised by. No brain, no nervous system, no organs, no muscles, no mouth. It's a colony of specialised cells that have agreed loosely to move water through themselves and keep whatever's edible. Calling it a creature feels generous. They can also be put through a sieve, broken down into individual cells, and given time, the cells will find each other and reassemble into a sponge again. That's a real thing that really happens. Take an animal apart entirely and it puts itself back together. Once you know that, the show's habit of putting SpongeBob through catastrophic physical damage and having him bounce back stops feeling like cartoon logic and starts feeling like an inside joke. Starfish are similarly odd. They have no brain either, just a decentralized nerve net. They can regenerate limbs, and in some species, a severed arm can regrow an entire animal, and their feeding method, for many of them, involves pushing their stomach out through their mouth, digesting the meal outside the body, and then pulling the stomach back in. Patrick's general incompetence and the way he occasionally does something physically impossible with his body are not, I suspect, entirely arbitrary. And then there's the thing that ties back to where we started, which is that the water around Bikini Atoll is now, of all things, in fairly good shape. Because people were kept away from it for decades, the reef there recovered further than anyone expected. Divers have reported coral in good condition and large marine life in numbers you wouldn't see in most comparable places. The reason is grim. Nobody's been fishing it or building on it because of what happened there, but the outcome is that the place is biologically doing rather well. The people who are moved off it are still dealing with the consequences, and no amount of healthy coral changes that. I don't want to tie a neat bow on it. What I'll say is that it's a fitting bit of trivia for a show made by a marine biologist. He'd have known about that reef. He almost certainly read the survey work, and I like the idea of him sitting at a desk in California drawing a burger restaurant, with all of that somewhere in the back of his head. Anyway, enough biology. 3 more before we get to the music, and they're deliberately mismatched because I don't want to leave you with the impression that this show only has one gear when it goes dark. Krabby Patty creature feature is the monster movie, and it's the most openly genre of anything the show has made. Plankton, still trying to get the formula after roughly 2 decades of failure, tampers with the patties, and what he produces turns anyone who eats one into a monster. Not a comedy monster, a proper one, hunched, drooling, grey with the teeth and the reaching hands and the shambling walk. The transformation is drawn as a transformation, with the stretching and the bones moving in the same register as the snail episode we talked about earlier. And then it spreads, because it's a restaurant, and restaurants serve a lot of people. So the back half of the episode is a full outbreak film. Empty streets, boarded windows, a small group of survivors in a building trying to work out who's been bitten. The show borrows the grammar wholesale, the slow crowd pressing against glass, the reveal that somebody in the room has already turned, the sprint down a corridor. It's on Nickelodeon's own list of the show's spookiest scenes, which tells you the network is entirely aware of what they made. What I like is that it doesn't apologise for itself at any point. There's no scene where somebody says, "Gosh, this is just like a horror film." It simply is one for 11 minutes, and then everyone's fine and the credits roll. I'd also say, and this is a personal preference, that the design of the monsters is better than it needs to be. They're recognisably the townspeople. You can tell which fish is which underneath. That's a much more unpleasant choice than making them generic. and somebody made it deliberately. The Curse of Bikini Bottom. I'd start somewhere in the middle of, with two figures floating down a busy high street while nobody looks up. That's the image the episode is built on, and it's a much sadder one than the premise suggests. SpongeBob and Patrick have been cursed by the Flying Dutchman and turned into ghosts, which sounds like a horror setup and is played as a comedy about being ignored. Because nobody can see them. That's the curse. They can float, they can pass through walls, they can go anywhere, and none of it matters because they've been removed from everyone else's world entirely. They try to interact with people. It doesn't work. They try to prove they exist. That doesn't work either. And there's a long middle stretch where they're just drifting around a town that is carrying on perfectly happily without them, watching their friends have conversations they can't join. That's a much more melancholy idea than the episode's tone lets on. There's a version of that story that's genuinely upsetting, and you can feel it under the surface, even while the show is doing gags about walking through Squidward. The resolution involves a group of ghost bikers, because of course it does, and the episode picks up a lot of energy at that point. But the middle bit is the reason it's here. Being invisible isn't a superpower in this episode. It's a loneliness episode with a different coat of paint on. And now the third one, which isn't a horror episode at all, and I'm including it on purpose. Have you seen this snail? SpongeBob gets obsessed with a paddleball toy, specifically with beating a record printed on the packaging, and in the process he stops feeding Gary, not out of malice. He simply doesn't notice. Gary waits, then Gary leaves, and the episode follows both halves of that. SpongeBob eventually surfaces from his obsession, realizes what's happened, and goes looking. He puts up posters, he walks the streets, he asks people. It's an accurate depiction of losing a pet, right down to the specific awful hopefulness of putting a photograph on a lamppost. Meanwhile, Gary has wandered to another town and been taken in by an elderly woman who, at first, seems lovely. She feeds him properly. She's kind. And then it becomes apparent that she has a great many snails, and that they are not doing well, and that she does not entirely understand what she's doing. The episode has a song in it. Tom Kenny sings it. It's about looking for Gary, and it's the only moment I can think of in the entire series where the show simply stops being funny for a couple of minutes and lets a character be sad. I've seen this episode described as creepy, and I don't think that's the right word. It's sad. There's a difference, and I think it's worth marking because a lot of what gets called the dark side of SpongeBob online is just the show occasionally taking something seriously. The horror episodes we've been through tonight are craft. Somebody watched a lot of monster films and wanted to have a go. This is something else. A writer's room deciding that a small yellow character forgetting to feed his pet deserved to be treated as an actual loss rather than a plot device. And it works because the show has spent so long being weightless. When nothing has consequences for a couple of hundred episodes, and then one thing does, it lands with a thump. Anyway, that's 3 episodes with very little in common, which was rather the point of putting them together. Last pair, and they're both about cardboard, which is not where you'd expect to end up in a video like this. Idiot Box aired alongside the Health Inspector episode, which makes that half hour of television a fairly remarkable pairing. A body disposal comedy and this. The premise: SpongeBob and Patrick order an enormous television, throw the television away and keep the box. Because the box is for imagination. Squidward thinks this is idiotic and says so, and then goes back inside. And then he hears things. That's the episode. From inside a cardboard box in a garden, he hears a mountain climbing expedition. He hears a racing car. He hears an orchestra. Full sound design, layered and detailed, coming out of a box that could not possibly contain any of it. He goes out to check. He opens the box. 2 idiots sitting on cardboard, doing nothing. He goes back in. The sounds start again. The sound design is the joke, and it's done far too well for a gag. These aren't cheap approximations. You get wind, altitude, rope creak, the specific echo of a large space. Whoever cut that together was not phoning it in, and the effect is that the audience believes the box more than Squidward does. What the episode does brilliantly is refuse to explain itself. There is no moment where the show tells you whether the sounds are real. Squidward hears them. We hear them. The box is empty. Both of those things stay true simultaneously for the whole runtime, and nobody addresses it. And Squidward's reaction is the correct one. For a person experiencing that, he becomes obsessed. He can't let it go. He needs to know how it works, and the not knowing eats him. He ends up in the box himself, trying to make it happen for him, and it doesn't. That last bit is where it stops being funny for me, in a good way. He tries. He genuinely tries. He sits in a cardboard box and attempts to imagine something, and nothing comes, and the show holds on his face while he fails. There's a whole essay in that, and I'm not going to write it at this hour, but the episode is underneath the noise about somebody who has lost the ability to play and is watching two people who haven't and cannot work out what they've got that he hasn't. The ending involves the box being taken away by the bin men with Squidward inside and a rubbish truck, which is exactly the ending he was always going to get. The secret box is the other one, and it's much smaller and much more unsettling. Patrick has a box. He won't say what's in it. SpongeBob wants to know, and that's it. That's the entire plot. A man has a box and won't open it. The episode understands that the frightening part of a secret isn't the content, it's the withholding. Patrick, who is generally incapable of keeping anything in his head for more than a minute, is completely immovable on this. He deflects. He changes the subject. And when pushed, he becomes evasive in a way that Patrick is never evasive, which is off-putting because it's out of character in a show where nobody has a character to be out of. SpongeBob's escalating attempts to see inside are the comedy. The dread is entirely in the object, a plain cardboard box sitting on a shelf that everybody keeps looking at. And the episode is patient with it. There's no ticking clock, no reason the box has to be opened by any particular point. It just sits there for 11 minutes while a friendship quietly deteriorates around it, which is a lot of confidence to place in a bit of packaging. He eventually gets it open, and what's inside is a piece of string. An embarrassing, mundane, completely harmless piece of string, except there's a hidden compartment, and the episode's final gag is that SpongeBob never finds it, never knows it's there, walks away satisfied, and the audience is shown that there is something else in the box, and is not told what it is. It's a photograph. That's all we're given. Patrick reacts to it with visible relief that it wasn't discovered, and the show never comes back to it, not once in more than 2 decades. That compartment is still shut. I think that's the single best executed piece of withheld information in the whole series, and it's in a season 2 episode about a starfish being embarrassed. 2 boxes then, one that contains everything and one that contains nothing, and in both cases the trouble comes from a character who cannot stop needing to know, which, now I say it out loud, is a fairly good description of why anyone watches a video like this one at midnight. Right. Music. Here's something that took me an embarrassingly long time to work out, and once you know it, you can't unknow it. Most of the music in SpongeBob was not written for SpongeBob. It comes from production music libraries, which, if you haven't come across the concept, is an entire industry that exists slightly out of sight of everything else. Companies record enormous catalogues of instrumental music, every mood, every genre, every possible use, and then license it out to anyone who needs a piece of music and doesn't have the budget or the time to commission one. Adverts, corporate videos, local news, documentaries, radio idents, and cartoons. The show leans on that world heavily, particularly the Hawaiian and Hapahaole material, the steel guitar, the ukulele, the swaying stuff that plays over establishing shots of the pineapple. That sound is the entire tonal identity of Bikini Bottom, and a lot of it was recorded decades before anyone thought of a cartoon sponge. Nicholas Carr, the show's longtime music editor, is the person picking those cues and stitching them together, and he's also written a great deal of original material in the same style, sound-alike pieces designed to sit next to the library tracks without anyone noticing the join, which is a specific and slightly thankless craft. Now here's the bit that connects to everything else we've talked about. The same industry that produced all those cheerful ukulele cues also produced the horror cues. Same shelf, different tab, and there's a lovely historical rhyme in this. There was a production music library called HiQ, run by Capitol Records, going from the early 1940s through to the late 70s. Perfectly ordinary business. Hundreds of cues licensed out to whoever needed them. The most famous thing ever scored with it was Night of the Living Dead, the 1968 one. Its producer Carl Hardman built the film's soundtrack out of library cues and then did something the licenses don't usually allow. He processed them, added echo and reverb, warped them into something that sounded like nothing else. That's why that film sounds the way it does. Not an original score, a catalogue used with imagination. I'm not going to claim a direct line from that specific library to the specific stings in Graveyard Shift because I haven't been able to verify that properly, and I'd rather not invent it. But the principle is exactly the same, and it explains something real about why these episodes work. The horror cues in this show are old. They have that dusty, over-recorded, slightly too much brass quality of mid-century orchestral library music. They don't sound like a modern cartoon trying to be scary. They sound like something you'd have heard behind a black and white monster film on a Sunday afternoon. So when the lights flicker in the Krusty Krab, you're not just hearing a scary noise, you're hearing an inherited one. The music is doing the same thing that the vampire cameo does, reaching back to a much older tradition of being frightened and pulling a bit of it forward. And here's a fun detail. That's also why the show's tone can turn on a sixpence, because there's no through-composed score holding a mood together. Each cue is a discrete object, dropped in and pulled out. You can go from a ukulele to a doom chord in a single frame without any transition, because there's nothing to transition. It's a cut, not a fade. That's a technical constraint, producing an artistic signature, which is my favourite kind of thing. Now, there's one more area I want to cover, and I'm going to be a bit careful with it. If you were online in the late 2000s and early 2010s, you'll know that SpongeBob became a magnet for a particular kind of internet story. The Lost episode, the tape somebody's uncle found at the studio, the version that only aired once and was pulled. Somebody would write a few hundred words describing an episode that doesn't exist, in which something dreadful happens, and it would spread. I'm not going to go through what those stories contain, because most of them are unpleasant for the sake of it, and none of them are real. But I do think the phenomenon is interesting, and it's worth understanding why it fixed on this show in particular. A few reasons, I reckon. The first is availability. SpongeBob was on constantly. Reruns all day, every day, for a decade, which means almost everybody had a slightly unreliable memory of having seen episodes they couldn't name. That's fertile ground. If you're certain you've seen hundreds of episodes, but can only list 20, there's an enormous gap where a fake one can live. The second is the show's own habit of ending on something quietly wrong. We've been through a whole video of examples. If the real show can finish on a scribble blinking inside a closed book, then the boundary of what's plausible is already further out than you'd think. The third is safety, which sounds contradictory, but I think is the main one. The stories work because the show is warm. You need something soft to violate. Nobody writes creepypasta about a horror franchise. There's no contrast, nothing to spoil. The whole genre depends on taking the least threatening thing in your childhood and putting a crack in it. And the show, to its credit, eventually noticed. There's a later episode called Welcome to Random Land, which builds a whole segment around a deliberately off, glitchy, wrong-feeling version of its own world, a place where the rules of the cartoon stop applying. It's the show acknowledging, with a fair bit of humour, that people have been imagining a broken version of it for years and offering an official one instead. I find that quite a healthy way to handle it. Rather than pretending the folklore doesn't exist, they made a joke out of it and moved on. So, that's where I'll leave it. What strikes me, having gone through all of these, is how little of it was accidental. Every time you find something in this show that unsettles you, you can usually trace it to a specific person making a specific decision. Somebody who remembered a monster magazine from their childhood, somebody who got on the wrong bus once, somebody who had read enough Poe to build an episode out of it, somebody who studied the actual ocean and knew that the actual ocean is already stranger than anything you'd invent. That's not a show stumbling into horror by mistake. That's a room full of people who happen to like this stuff, working on something that gave them room to use it. And I think that's why these episodes have lasted while a lot of the sillier ones haven't. They were made with care by people who were enjoying themselves. There's plenty more here, honestly. I barely scratched the run of Squidward episodes that go somewhere properly melancholy, or the background art and the people who painted it, or the films, which have their own strange corners. I've got videos planned on a couple of those, so if that sounds like your sort of thing, it'll turn up eventually. For now though, that's the lot. The lights flicker, the phone rings, there's nobody there, and it's almost certainly just a bloke ringing about a job. Sleep